Make sure the downstairs bathroom shines before the guests arrive, and don't sit on the living room furniture with those clothes, my daughter-in-law snapped the second I stepped through my son's front door. I stood there quietly holding the blueberry pie I had baked at 6 that morning, still warm through the dish towel wrapped around it, while Vanessa stared at me like I was a delivery person who had arrived late. For a moment, I thought maybe I had misunderstood her. Maybe she was joking. But then she tossed a pair of yellow rubber gloves onto the hallway table without even looking at me. "And please hurry," she added, already turning away in her silk blouse and white pants. "Guests will be here in less than an hour." My son Ethan appeared briefly from the kitchen holding a tray of glasses. He glanced at me. Then at the gloves. Then he looked away. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, like nothing unusual had happened. "Traffic okay?" I smiled because I didn't trust myself to say anything else. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and vanilla candles. Soft jazz music drifted through the ceiling speakers. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of preparation for Mia's 12th birthday party. Pink balloons floated near the staircase. Wrapped gifts covered the dining table. Vanessa had even hired a photographer. It looked beautiful. The kind of family celebration I used to create myself back when Ethan was little and our house was still filled with noise and laughter instead of tension that settled into the walls like cold air. I set the pie carefully on the kitchen counter. Vanessa immediately moved it aside to make room for a catered dessert tray. "Oh," she said lightly, barely glancing at it. "You actually baked something." I looked down at my hands. Flour still clung faintly beneath my nails from this morning. "It's Mia's favorite," I said softly. Vanessa opened the refrigerator and slid the pie onto the bottom shelf behind several containers. "Well, we already have dessert handled, but maybe someone will eat it later." Someone. Not Mia. Not family. Just someone. Ethan kept arranging glasses as though he hadn't heard any of it. I watched him for a second longer. Than I should have. At 42, he still had the same green eyes he'd had as a little boy. George used to say our son had honest eyes. Lately, though, Ethan never held my gaze very long. "The bathroom?" Vanessa called sharply from the foyer. "Please don't make me ask twice." I nodded slowly and picked up the gloves. The downstairs bathroom was already clean. I could tell the moment I stepped inside. The mirror gleamed. Fresh hand towels hung neatly beside the sink. There wasn't even water spotting on the faucet. Still, I rolled up my sleeves and started wiping the counter anyway. Outside the door, I could hear laughter and footsteps as guests began arriving. Every now and then, Vanessa's bright voice floated through the hallway. Warm. Charming. Polished. The version of herself she saved for other people. I heard her greet neighbors, compliment dresses, laugh too loudly at harmless jokes. But whenever she spoke to me, her voice changed. Sharper. Colder. Like she was speaking to someone beneath her. I finished cleaning and quietly stepped into the hallway. A little girl I didn't recognize looked up at me near the staircase. "Are you the maid?" she asked innocently. Before I could answer, Vanessa appeared beside her holding a tray of sparkling water. She smiled. "No, sweetheart," she said sweetly. Then she looked directly at me. "She's Ethan's mother." The little girl blinked awkwardly, embarrassed now, but Vanessa simply walked away smiling as if she'd corrected something amusing. I stood frozen beside the staircase while conversations hummed around me. Ethan saw the whole thing from across the room. He said nothing. Not one word. Something inside my chest tightened, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a knot being pulled tighter and tighter. I wandered toward the garage for a moment just to breathe. The noise of the party faded slightly once the door closed behind me. That was when I saw it. George's framed photograph sat on a dusty shelf beside a box of old paint cans and gardening supplies. My husband's picture used to sit proudly in Ethan's living room after he passed away 3 years ago. Now it leaned crooked beside a rusted toolbox beneath. A spider-webbed corner light. I walked toward it slowly. George was smiling in the photograph, wearing the navy sweater Mia once said made him look like a movie star. My throat burned suddenly. Not because of the photo itself. Because I understood exactly what it meant. Little things disappear from a family before people do. First your opinions. Then your traditions. Then your seat at the table. Eventually, even your memories are moved somewhere out of sight. I reached down and wiped dust from the frame with my sleeve. From inside the house, I heard Vanessa laughing again. Loud enough for everyone to hear. I stared at George's photograph for a long moment before whispering quietly, "You were right about her." Then I picked up the frame carefully and held it against my chest while the birthday party carried on without me. I stayed in the garage longer than I needed to. The concrete floor felt cold even through my shoes, and somewhere outside, wind rattled the loose branch of the maple tree hanging over Ethan's driveway. I held George's photograph against my chest and stared at the dusty shelf where Vanessa had left it like an object nobody wanted anymore. 3 years earlier, that same photograph had stood in the center of our dining room surrounded by candles after his funeral. People had cried looking at it. Ethan had cried too. Back then he had wrapped his arms around me in the church parking lot and whispered, "You will never be alone, Mom." I remembered believing him. That was the dangerous thing about grief. It made promises sound permanent. I carefully carried the frame back inside before anyone noticed I was gone. The party had fully started now. Music floated through the house. Children ran through the hallway holding slices of pizza on paper plates. Adults gathered in small circles pretending their lives were simpler than they really were. Vanessa moved through the crowd effortlessly, smiling with practiced perfection. She touched shoulders when she laughed. She tilted her head when she listened. Everyone loved her. Or thought they did. The moment she saw me carrying George's picture, her smile stiffened for half a second. Only half a second. Then it disappeared behind another polished expression. "Oh," she said lightly, lowering her voice as though embarrassed for me. "I moved that into storage because it did not match the living room anymore." Did not match. I looked around at the white furniture, the glass coffee table, the silver decorations arranged perfectly beside expensive candles. My husband of 46 years no longer matched the room. "I think Mia should still see her grandfather," I said quietly. Vanessa gave a tiny shrug. "Children move on faster than we do." Then she walked away before I could answer. Ethan was standing near the dining room pouring wine for 2 neighbors. I waited for him to say something. Anything. But he only glanced at the frame in my hands and quickly looked back down at the bottle. That hurt more than Vanessa ever could. Cruelty from strangers is easy to understand. Silence from your own child is what stays with you at night. I placed George's photograph carefully on the bookshelf near the fireplace where it used to sit. 10 minutes later, I noticed it was gone again. This time I did not ask where Vanessa had moved it. I already knew. Around 7 o'clock, Mia opened presents in the living room while everyone gathered around clapping and recording videos on their phones. I sat quietly in the corner beside the staircase. Not one chair had been saved for me near the family. I noticed Vanessa's mother sitting there instead, laughing loudly with a glass of champagne balanced elegantly in her hand. Mia barely glanced at the blueberry pie still hidden inside the refrigerator. She tore through expensive gifts one after another while Ethan filmed everything proudly. New headphones. Designer sneakers. A tablet computer. Then Mia opened a small envelope from me. Inside was a charm bracelet that had belonged to my mother. Sterling silver. Tiny blue stones shaped like forget-me-nots. Mia stared at it politely without smiling. Before she could say anything, Vanessa leaned down beside her and whispered loudly enough for me to hear, "That is more of an old-fashioned piece, sweetheart." Mia nodded immediately. "Thanks, Grandma," she said quickly before setting it aside unopened beside the empty wrapping paper. 20 minutes later, I found the bracelet forgotten beneath the couch. I slipped it back into my purse without saying a word. The evening dragged on slowly after that. I washed dishes nobody asked Vanessa to wash. I wiped counters already clean. Every time I tried sitting down, someone needed something. More ice. More napkins. Another tray moved outside. Vanessa never raised her voice again after earlier. She did not need to. The humiliation had become quieter now. More efficient. At one point, I overheard one of the guests ask Ethan whether I lived with them. No, Vanessa answered before he could speak. But she is here a lot lately. The way she said lately made me sound temporary. Dependent. Like someone overstaying her welcome. I looked down at my hands in the sink water. My wedding ring still rested on my finger even though George had been gone for years. I never stopped wearing it. Not because I could not move on. Because it reminded me there was once a time when somebody looked at me with respect. Near the end of the party, I stepped outside onto the back patio for air. The sun had almost disappeared behind the neighboring houses, painting the sky orange and grey. Through the sliding glass doors, I could see Vanessa laughing with guests while Ethan stood beside her looking tired and distant. They looked like one of those perfect suburban couples people envy online. Beautiful house. Beautiful daughter. Beautiful photographs. But houses become strange places when love turns into hierarchy. I heard the door slide open behind me. Mia stepped outside holding her phone. Mom says if you come next weekend, you can help organize the garage too, she said casually without looking up from the screen. Then she added, almost absent-mindedly, she says old people should earn their stay. The words hit harder than Vanessa's command earlier that afternoon. Because this time, they came from a child. Mia walked back inside before I could respond. I stood there alone on the patio while laughter echoed through the house behind me. Then slowly, very slowly, something inside me stopped hurting and started hardening instead. I left Ethan's house little after 9 that evening carrying the same blueberry pie I had brought that morning. The dish felt heavier now, even though only one slice was missing. Vanessa had wrapped it tightly in foil before handing it back to me at the door. We already have too many leftovers, she said with a smile polished enough for nearby guests to admire. I thanked her anyway. Old habits survive longer than dignity sometimes. The drive home took 40 minutes. Streetlights blurred softly across my windshield while an old jazz station played quietly through the car speakers. George used to love driving at night. He said darkness made people honest because there was nothing left to perform for. I kept thinking about Mia's words on the patio. Old people should earn their stay. Children do not invent sentences like that on their own. They inherit them the same way they inherit eye color or family recipes. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the neighborhood was silent. My small ranch house sat exactly as I had left it that morning. One porch light glowing. Curtains drawn neatly. The bird feeder George built still hanging beside the maple tree near the mailbox. Nothing had changed. Yet everything felt different. I carried the pie inside and set it untouched on the kitchen counter. Then I removed my shoes slowly and stood in the quiet. No music. No guests. No tension humming beneath every conversation. Just silence. Honest silence. I looked around the kitchen at the little details George and I had built together over 46 years. The copper kettle above the stove. The faded cookbook with handwritten notes tucked between pages. The small crack in the tile floor near the refrigerator that Ethan made dropping a bowling trophy when he was 16. Every corner of the house held proof that I had once belonged somewhere completely. That realization settled into me slowly. Vanessa treated me like a burden in her home while standing inside a life partly built by my husband's sacrifices. George had emptied retirement savings to help Ethan with the down payment on that house 12 years earlier. I still remembered the night he signed the check. We are giving him stability, he told me proudly. A foundation for his family. George worked nearly every weekend during his 60s to recover financially after that. Extra consulting jobs. Long hours. Delayed vacations. He never complained once. He believed helping family meant something permanent. I walked into the living room and lowered myself carefully onto the couch. My knees ached from standing all afternoon. On the side table sat the framed photograph Ethan had given me on my 70th birthday. It showed all of us together at Thanksgiving 2 years earlier. Ethan smiling. Mia missing one front tooth. Vanessa leaning elegantly against the kitchen counter with one hand resting possessively on Ethan's shoulder. Looking at the picture now felt strange, like staring at actors playing a family instead of a real one. I noticed something else too. In the photograph, I was standing slightly apart from the others. I had never realized it before. My phone buzzed suddenly on the coffee table. For one hopeful second, I thought it might be Ethan calling to apologize. Instead, it was a text from Vanessa. "You forgot your cleaning gloves. We will need them next weekend too." I stared at the message for a long time. No thank you for coming. No mention of the bracelet. No acknowledgement that I was Ethan's mother or Mia's grandmother. Just gloves. I placed the phone face down without replying. Then I did something I had not done in months. I opened the hallway closet and pulled out George's old winter coat. The dark navy one he wore every December no matter how mild the weather was. His leather gloves were still tucked inside the pocket exactly where he always left them. I slipped my hand inside and found a folded piece of paper. My chest tightened immediately because I recognized George's handwriting before I even opened it. The note was old and slightly creased. Probably years old. I sat down carefully beneath the hallway lamp and unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Helen," it began, "if you are reading this one day after I am gone, remember something important. Love does not require you to shrink yourself for other people's comfort." I stopped breathing for a moment. George had always hidden little. Notes around the house. Inside books. Coat pockets. Toolboxes. He said ordinary days needed surprises. I continued reading slowly. "You spent your whole life taking care of everyone around you. Promise me you will notice when people stop treating your kindness like a gift and start treating it like an obligation." My eyes burned, but I did not cry. Not anymore. I simply sat there holding the note while the clock ticked softly above the fireplace. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the windows. I suddenly remembered something Robert Hayes had said at George's funeral reception 3 years ago. "Your husband planned for everything," he told me quietly while everyone else ate casseroles in the kitchen. At the time, grief swallowed the meaning of those words before I could think about them carefully. But now they returned to me with unsettling clarity. Planned for everything. I folded George's note carefully and slipped it back into the coat pocket. Then I looked around my quiet little house again. For the first time in months, I no longer felt lonely sitting there alone. I felt observant. Awake. Like somebody who had finally stopped ignoring small cracks spreading through the walls around her. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and made coffee while rain clouds still covered the neighborhood. My phone buzzed again just after 7. Another message from Vanessa. "Do not forget Mia has piano lessons Saturday morning. Be there by 8. Not a request. An instruction." I stared at the message while steam rose from my coffee cup. Then slowly, for the first time since George died, I did not immediately reach for my car keys. I spent the entire morning moving slowly through the house with my phone turned face down on the kitchen counter. Every hour or so, another message from Vanessa appeared across the screen. "Mia needs lunch packed. Do not forget the dry cleaning pickup. Please try not to be late this time." Not once did she ask whether I was available. She spoke to me the same way hotels leave instruction cards for housekeeping staff. Around 10 o'clock, I finally picked up the phone and typed 3 simple words. "I cannot today." I stared at the message for nearly a full minute before pressing send. My heart beat harder than it should have over something so small. Then I set the phone down and waited. The reply came less than 30 seconds later. "Excuse me?" Another message followed immediately. "Ethan already told Mia you were coming." Then another. "What exactly are you busy with?" I looked around my quiet kitchen while sunlight pushed weakly through the windows. For years, I had organized my life around everyone else's schedules. School pickups, doctor appointments, birthday parties, emergency babysitting, last-minute errands. After George passed away, it only became worse. Vanessa slowly filled every empty hour of my week until my own life disappeared somewhere underneath hers. And the strange part was how gradually it happened. People do not usually notice when they are becoming invisible. It happens politely, one favor at a time. My phone rang suddenly. "Ethan." I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said quickly, already sounding irritated. "What is going on?" I stirred my coffee slowly even though it no longer needed stirring. Nothing is going on. Vanessa said you are refusing to help today. Refusing. The word sat heavily between us. I glanced out the kitchen window toward George's old garden. Winter had stripped most of the color away, but the stone path he built still cut cleanly through the yard. I am tired, Ethan. Silence. Then a sigh. Mom, Mia was counting on you. Not Vanessa. Not him. Mia. He knew exactly where to place guilt because I had taught him how much family mattered his entire life. I have spent 12 years helping whenever you asked, I said softly. One Saturday should not create a crisis. Another silence followed. Longer this time. I could almost picture him rubbing his forehead the way George used to during stressful conversations. Vanessa already booked appointments today, he muttered finally. Everything kind of depends on you. Depends on me. The words echoed strangely in my mind because nobody in that house treated me like someone important. They treated me like electricity. Something expected to work quietly in the background every day without appreciation until it suddenly stopped. I am sorry, I said calmly. You will have to figure it out. Then I ended the call before my courage disappeared. My hands shook afterward. Not from fear exactly. From unfamiliarity. Boundaries feel unnatural when you have spent a lifetime erasing your own. The house felt strangely still after that conversation. I walked slowly into the living room and sat beside the fireplace with George's note resting in my lap. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawn mower buzzed faintly despite the cold weather. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Yet something fundamental had shifted inside me. Around noon, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened the front door and found Robert Hayes standing on the porch holding a paper bag from the bakery downtown. I brought cinnamon rolls, he announced with a crooked smile. Robert had been George's closest friend for nearly 40 years. Tall. Silver-haired. Always wearing old leather jackets no matter the season. George used to joke that Robert dressed like a retired country singer. I invited him inside, and within minutes the kitchen smelled like coffee and warm sugar instead of loneliness. Robert studied my face quietly while I poured coffee into 2 mugs. You look exhausted, Helen. I gave a small laugh. That obvious? To somebody who knows you, yes. We sat at the kitchen table while rain tapped softly against the windows. For a while we talked about ordinary things. The weather. His arthritis. The diner near Main Street closing after 30 years. But eventually Robert leaned back in his chair and asked the question I had been avoiding even asking myself. What are Ethan and Vanessa doing to you? The room went very quiet after that. I stared down into my coffee cup. Steam curled upward slowly between us. Nothing dramatic, I answered finally. Just little things. Robert nodded once. Those are usually the things that matter most. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked. There was no pity in his expression. Only concern. That made it easier somehow. So I told him about the bathroom. The gloves. The birthday party. Mia repeating. Vanessa's words like they were normal. I even told him about George's photograph sitting forgotten in the garage beside paint cans. Robert listened without interrupting once. But the longer I spoke, the tighter his jaw became. When I finally finished, he sat very still for several seconds before reaching slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small cream-colored envelope and placed it gently on the kitchen table between us. My name was written across the front in George's handwriting. Suddenly the room felt colder. George asked me to hold on to this, Robert said quietly. Only if you ever started doubting your place in your own family. I stared at the envelope without touching it. What is it? Robert exhaled slowly and looked directly at me. Your husband knew more than you think. I did not touch the envelope immediately. It sat on the kitchen table between Robert and me while rain slid down the windows in long silver streaks. My name looked strange in George's handwriting now. Familiar, but distant too. Like hearing the voice of someone you loved through an old recording. Robert wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and waited patiently while I stared at it. He had always understood silence better than most people. George used to say Robert never interrupted because he already knew life eventually revealed everything on its own. Finally, I reached forward and picked up the envelope carefully. The paper felt thicker than normal stationery. Expensive. Deliberate. George never did anything carelessly. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the seal. Inside was a folded document and another handwritten note. I recognized George's handwriting immediately. Strong. Precise. Calm. Even his letters looked dependable. Helen, the note began, if Robert has given this to you, then something has changed inside our family that can no longer be ignored. My throat tightened instantly. I kept reading slowly while the kitchen grew quieter around me. You always saw the best in people, especially Ethan. That is one of the reasons I loved you. But love sometimes blinds kind people to patterns they should never excuse. I paused there. Patterns. The word lingered heavily in my mind because suddenly dozens of small memories began connecting themselves together like puzzle pieces I had spent years refusing to arrange properly. Vanessa insisting on controlling every holiday after the wedding. Ethan calling less and less unless they needed money or childcare. The subtle jokes about my age. The way decisions happened around me instead of with me. None of it had arrived dramatically. It arrived politely. Gradually. Like furniture slowly disappearing from a room one piece at a time until one day the space no longer felt like yours. I unfolded the second paper carefully. Legal documents. Trust information. Property details. My eyes moved slowly across paragraphs filled with terms I barely understood at first. Then one sentence stopped me completely. The property located on Birchwood Lane shall remain protected under the Carter Family Trust until the surviving spouse, Helen Carter, voluntarily authorizes transfer or sale. Birchwood Lane. Ethan's house. I looked up sharply at Robert. George put Ethan's house into a trust. Robert nodded once. Years ago. Why would he do that without telling me? Robert exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. Because he was worried. I stared at him in disbelief. George rarely worried openly about anything. He believed most problems could be solved quietly with patience and preparation. About Vanessa? I asked softly. Robert hesitated before answering. About what Ethan became after marrying her. The kitchen clock ticked steadily behind us. Outside, the rain had slowed into a faint drizzle. I looked back down at the paperwork in my hands. My husband had seen something years before I did. Not one single event. Not cruelty obvious enough to start a family war. Something subtler. A shift. A pattern. George noticed Ethan changing little by little. Robert continued carefully. He never hated Vanessa. But he believed she treated relationships like transactions. Everything had value to her if it benefited her somehow. My chest tightened again because deep down, I already knew that was true. Vanessa measured affection the same way some people measured square footage or investment returns. Useful people received warmth. Inconvenient people received tolerance. There is more, Robert said quietly. I looked up. He tapped one section of the document with his finger. George added conditions to the trust. I lowered my eyes again and read more carefully this time. My breathing slowed as the meaning settled in piece by piece. Ethan could continue living in the house. But ownership protections changed completely if there was evidence of emotional neglect, coercion, or financial manipulation directed toward me after George's death. The trust gave me legal authority George had never mentioned while he was alive. I sat there speechless for several seconds. Not because of the money. George and I were never wealthy people. But because of what the documents represented. He had believed me. Even before anything became obvious. He had quietly prepared a way to protect my dignity long before I realized it needed protecting. He thought I would eventually see things clearly on my own, I whispered. Robert nodded slowly. George knew you better than anybody. I folded the papers carefully and rested my hands on top of them. Suddenly dozens of moments from the past few years replayed differently in my memory. Vanessa encouraging Ethan to renovate rooms while casually mentioning how expensive my house must be in today's market. Ethan repeatedly asking whether I had considered downsizing. Vanessa suggesting I move closer to them for convenience. At the time, each conversation sounded harmless by itself. Now they felt connected. Intentional. My phone buzzed suddenly on the table again. Vanessa. Another message. Mia is disappointed in you. A second one appeared immediately after. Family should help each other. I stared at the words while something inside me grew unexpectedly calm. Not angry. Calm. Because for the first time, I could finally see the imbalance clearly instead of emotionally. Family should help each other. Yet somehow help had only flowed in one direction for years. Robert watched my expression carefully. What did she say? He asked. I turned the phone around silently so he could read the messages himself. His jaw tightened. Then he looked back at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not sympathy. Certainty. Helen, he said quietly, they think you need them more than they need you. I looked down at George's documents resting beneath my hands. Then slowly, for the first time in a very long while, I realized that assumption might become the biggest mistake they ever made. The following week felt different in ways nobody could see yet. I still woke up early. Still watered the plants near the front porch. Still folded laundry while morning news murmured softly from the television in the background. From the outside, my life looked exactly the same. But internally, something had shifted permanently. Once a person recognizes disrespect clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend confusion afterward. Vanessa continued sending messages almost every day. Grocery pickups. School transportation. Last-minute babysitting requests disguised as emergencies. But now I noticed patterns instead of obligations. She never asked how I was feeling. Never invited me simply to spend time together. Every conversation had a purpose attached to it. A task. A need. A responsibility waiting for me to carry it. On Wednesday afternoon, Ethan called while I was trimming dead roses in the backyard. Hey, Mom, he said casually. Too casually. Vanessa mentioned you have been kind of distant lately. I set the gardening shears down beside the flower bed. I have been busy. Busy doing what? The question came quickly, almost automatically. Not cruel exactly. Just entitled. Like he genuinely believed access to my time belonged to them by default. I looked across the yard toward George's old workshop near the fence line. The paint had faded over the years, but the little brass wind chime above the door still moved gently in the breeze. Living my own life, Ethan. Silence. Then a short awkward laugh. Mom, come on. No, I answered softly. I mean it. Another pause followed. I could practically hear him recalculating the conversation in real time. Vanessa has been overwhelmed, he said finally. Mia has activities almost every day now. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. Not concern. For me. Logistics. You and Vanessa are her parents, I replied calmly. Parents usually handle their children's schedules. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose. George used to make that exact sound whenever he felt cornered in an argument. Nobody is saying you have to do everything. I almost smiled hearing that. Because for years, that was exactly what they had quietly expected. Not through demands alone. Through guilt. Through obligation. Through the constant suggestion that family love should require unlimited sacrifice from only one person. I need to go, I said gently before he could continue. Dinner is in the oven. There was no dinner in the oven. But I was beginning to understand something important. People who depend on your constant availability become uncomfortable the moment you develop boundaries. After the call ended, I stayed outside longer than necessary, letting cold air settle around me. The neighborhood was peaceful at that hour. A few children rode bicycles slowly down the street while sprinklers ticked rhythmically across nearby lawns. Ordinary suburban life. Yet beneath that calm surface, entire families quietly survived on unspoken imbalances nobody acknowledged directly. Later that evening, I opened the hall closet searching for an old photo album and found another box tucked behind George's winter coats. Inside were years of financial folders organized neatly in his handwriting. Mortgage records, insurance documents, investment papers. George kept everything. I carried the box into the living room and spent nearly 2 hours reading through old records beneath the glow of the lamp beside the couch. The more I read, the more uncomfortable I became. George had helped Ethan repeatedly over the years. Down payments, credit card debt after the wedding, a business loan Ethan once called temporary. Every time financial trouble appeared, George quietly handled it without humiliating our son. I remembered those moments differently now. Back then I thought we were simply helping family during difficult seasons. But reading the records together all at once revealed another pattern entirely. Ethan and Vanessa had built their comfortable life, partly on resources they never truly respected. My phone buzzed around 8 o'clock. This time it was Mia calling through video chat. I answered immediately despite everything because hearing her voice still softened something inside me. Her face appeared on the screen framed by messy blonde hair and pink pajamas. "Grandma," she said quickly, "Mom wants to know if you can come Friday night because they are going to some dinner thing." Dinner thing. Another obligation waiting quietly beneath casual wording. "Not this Friday, sweetheart." Mia frowned instantly. "Why not?" I hesitated carefully. "Because Grandma has plans." "What plans?" Children ask questions adults avoid. I looked around my living room at the stack of papers surrounding me. George's records. George's notes. George's careful preparations. Important ones, I answered softly. Mia looked genuinely confused now. "Mom says you are retired." The sentence landed strangely because it sounded exactly like Vanessa's thinking. Retired people become resources in certain families. Flexible. Available. Convenient. "Retired does not mean my life stopped," I said gently. Mia grew quiet after that. Somewhere off screen, I heard Vanessa's voice asking who she was talking to. Mia turned briefly toward the sound. Then she looked back at me and lowered her voice slightly. "Mom is mad at you." I nodded once. "I know. Are you mad at us?" The question hurt because she sounded worried now instead of rude. I chose my words carefully. "No, sweetheart. But sometimes people need to remember how to treat each other kindly." Mia stared at me silently for a moment before whispering, "Mom says you are being dramatic lately." I felt something inside me go completely still then. Not pain. Not anger. Clarity. Because children always reveal the truth adults try hardest to hide. I ended the call gently a few minutes later and sat alone in the quiet house afterward. Then slowly, I reached for the trust documents again. This time, I did not read them like a frightened widow searching for reassurance. I read them like someone finally preparing to protect herself. 2 weeks passed before I saw Ethan and Vanessa again in person. During that time, the messages became colder, shorter, less disguised. Vanessa stopped pretending her requests were favors and started speaking as though my absence had inconvenienced an entire system built around me. Ethan called twice, but both conversations circled back to schedules, responsibilities, and how stressed Vanessa supposedly felt lately. Not once did either of them ask why I had suddenly pulled away after years of constant help. That told me everything I needed to know. On Thursday evening, Ethan finally called with a different tone in his voice. Careful. Measured. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa and I are hosting a dinner Saturday night. A few business contacts are coming over. It would mean a lot if you came." Business contacts. I almost declined immediately. Then something inside me paused. "All right," I answered calmly. "I will be there." The silence on Ethan's end sounded almost relieved. "Good," he said quickly. "That is good." Saturday evening arrived cold and windy. I drove to Birchwood Lane just after 6 wearing the dark blue coat George always loved on me. The same pearl earrings he bought for our 30th anniversary rested against my neck. Simple. Elegant. Quiet confidence. When I stepped inside the house, everything looked immaculate again. Soft lighting. Fresh flowers on the dining table. Expensive wine breathing on the kitchen counter. Vanessa stood near the staircase greeting guests in a fitted cream dress, smiling with effortless sophistication. She looked surprised when she saw me dressed formally instead of arriving prepared to work. Her eyes flicked briefly toward my empty hands. No casserole dish. No grocery bags. No cleaning supplies. "Helen," she said after a tiny pause. "You made it." I smiled politely. "You invited me." Ethan appeared beside her almost immediately, nervous energy radiating from his face. "Hey, Mom." He kissed my cheek quickly. His eyes lingered on me longer than usual tonight. Almost cautious. Like he sensed something changing but could not yet identify what it was. Guests filled the living room holding wine glasses and discussing mortgage rates, private schools, and vacation homes in Colorado. Everyone laughed too. Loudly at small jokes. The air smelled faintly of cedar candles and expensive perfume. Vanessa moved through the room like someone auditioning for a better life. Every detail of the evening had been designed for approval. I noticed immediately that there was no place card for me at the dining table. 8 chairs. 8 names. None of them mine. Interesting. Vanessa noticed me noticing. "Oh," she said lightly, touching my arm as though the omission were harmless. "We assumed you would not want to stay too long." I looked directly at her. "Why would you assume that?" She blinked once. Tiny crack. Then the polished smile returned. "Well, you usually like quiet evenings." Before I could answer, one of the guests approached us. A man in his 50s wearing a navy blazer and an overconfident smile. "You must be Ethan's mother," he said warmly. "Vanessa has told us so much about you." I glanced briefly at Vanessa. Her expression remained perfectly pleasant. "Only good things, I hope," I replied softly. The man laughed. "She says you are incredibly helpful." Helpful. Not loving. Not kind. Not family. Helpful. Like an appliance people appreciate until it stops functioning properly. Dinner began 20 minutes later. Vanessa seated me at the far end of the table beside Mia while everyone else clustered near Ethan discussing investments and property values. Throughout the meal, Vanessa performed generosity constantly for her guests. Refilling wine glasses. Complimenting careers. Laughing delicately with one hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. But every interaction with me carried the same subtle edge underneath it. "Helen, could you grab more bread from the kitchen? Helen, would you mind clearing these plates? Helen," Mia spilled water again. Small requests delivered publicly enough that refusing would seem rude. I complied quietly each time, not because I felt obligated anymore, but because I was watching. Watching how naturally they expected service from me. Watching how invisible my labor had become inside this house. Halfway through dessert, the conversation shifted toward real estate. One of Ethan's guests mentioned rising property values in our neighborhood. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. "Honestly, older people sit on homes that are way too large for them." Several guests chuckled politely. My fork paused gently above my plate. Vanessa continued smiling into her wine glass. Some people would rather cling to memories than make practical decisions. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside her. Not enough to stop her. Just enough to reveal he understood exactly who she meant. The table grew quieter. Then Vanessa lifted her glass slightly and smiled across the candles. "To family," she said sweetly. "And to people finally knowing when it is time to let go." A few guests raised their glasses uncertainly. I looked directly at Ethan. He would not meet my eyes. Something very calm settled over me then. Not sadness. Not humiliation. The complete absence of confusion. Slowly, I placed my napkin beside my untouched dessert plate and stood up from the table. The room quieted immediately. Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly. "Helen," she asked carefully. I folded my hands together loosely in front of me. "You are right about one thing, Vanessa," I said softly. "There does come a moment when people finally see situations clearly." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the music from the kitchen suddenly felt distant. Ethan stared at me now, pale and tense. I reached calmly into my handbag and removed a cream-colored folder. George's handwriting rested neatly across the front. Then, before either of them could speak again, the doorbell rang. The sound of the doorbell cut through the dining room so sharply that nobody moved for a second. Vanessa still held her wine glass halfway in the air, frozen between confidence and confusion. Ethan looked pale beside her now, his eyes locked on the cream-colored folder in my hands. One of the guests shifted awkwardly in his chair, sensing something uncomfortable unfolding beneath the polished surface of the evening. Then the doorbell rang again. Calm. Patient. Certain. Vanessa recovered first. She forced a quick laugh and glanced around the table. "Excuse me," she said lightly, though tension had crept into her voice now. She walked toward the foyer in careful heels while everyone else remained silent behind her. I stayed standing beside my chair with my hands resting gently on the folder. My heart was beating steadily, but not wildly. That surprised me most. I had imagined confrontation many times over the previous weeks, yet now that the moment had arrived, I felt strangely peaceful. Because truth removes confusion. And confusion had exhausted me far more than cruelty ever did. A few seconds later, footsteps echoed back through the hallway. Vanessa reappeared first, but her expression had completely changed. The polished smile was gone. Behind her stood Robert Hayes in his old leather jacket beside a tall grey-haired man carrying a slim black briefcase. Ethan immediately pushed back his chair and stood up. "Robert?" he asked sharply. The attorney gave a polite nod to the room before speaking. "Good evening." Nobody answered. The atmosphere had shifted entirely now. Even the guests could feel it. Vanessa glanced quickly toward Ethan, searching his face for explanation, but he looked just as unsettled as she did. Robert stepped calmly beside me while the attorney remained near the doorway. Then Robert looked directly at Ethan with an expression I had never seen on him before. Deep disappointment. "Your father trusted you," he said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. "What is this?" Vanessa demanded suddenly. "What exactly is going on?" Her voice carried irritation now, but underneath it I heard something new for the first time. Fear. I slowly opened the cream-colored folder and removed several documents. The sound of paper sliding across the dining table seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. "Before George passed away," I said calmly, "he created legal protections connected to this house." Vanessa laughed once. Short. Sharp. Defensive. "Helen, this is not the time for dramatics." I looked directly at her. "No. This is the time for honesty." Ethan stared down at the documents now as if he already recognized them. His shoulders had tightened completely. The attorney finally stepped forward and opened his briefcase carefully. "Mr. Carter established the Birchwood Family Trust 11 years ago," he explained in a professional tone. "The property ownership structure contains several protective conditions involving Mrs. Helen Carter." Vanessa blinked rapidly. "What conditions?" The attorney removed a pair of glasses and glanced briefly at the papers before continuing. "In the event of documented emotional coercion, financial pressure, or sustained mistreatment directed toward Mrs. Carter after Mr. Carter's death, the trust permits immediate review and suspension of future ownership transfer rights." Nobody at the table moved. Even the guests looked stunned now. Vanessa stared at the attorney as though she had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. "That is ridiculous," she snapped finally. "Mistreatment. We have done everything for her." Robert spoke before I could answer. "You turned her into unpaid labor inside a house partly purchased by her husband." Vanessa's face flushed instantly. "That is not true." "Is it not?" Robert asked quietly. His calmness made the room feel even colder. Ethan finally spoke then, but his voice sounded weaker than I had ever heard it. "Dad never told me about this." "Your father noticed things," Robert replied. "Long before Helen allowed herself to." Vanessa looked toward Ethan sharply now. "You knew about this trust?" "No," Ethan answered immediately. But uncertainty flickered across his face right after he spoke. Small memories were catching up to him now too. Conversations with George. Questions he once ignored. Warnings disguised as ordinary advice. I reached slowly into my purse and removed my phone. Then, without raising my voice, I placed it on the table beside the legal documents. One by one, I opened Vanessa's recent messages. Do not forget Mia has piano lessons. We will need the gloves next weekend too. Family should help each other. What exactly are you busy with? I did not need to explain them. Read together aloud in the silent dining room, they explained themselves. One of the guests lowered his eyes uncomfortably. Another reached for his wine glass but stopped halfway. The illusion inside the room was collapsing now. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way truth usually works. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So this is what this is about, she said. Bitterly. Because I asked for help. I looked at her steadily. No. This is about the way you stopped seeing me as family a long time ago. The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then rubbed one hand across his mouth. For the first time since George died, he looked ashamed instead of defensive. The attorney gathered the papers neatly back into the folder before speaking again. Mrs. Carter currently retains substantial authority regarding the future status of this property. Vanessa turned toward Ethan immediately, panic flashing openly across her face now. What does that mean? Ethan did not answer. Because finally, he understood. The house. The renovations. The image of stability they built their entire life around. None of it had ever been as secure as they assumed. And the woman they treated like an inconvenience had quietly held more dignity and more power than either of them realized. I picked up the folder calmly and looked around the table one last time. The candles still flickered softly beside half-finished wine glasses and untouched dessert plates. Everything appeared beautiful from a distance. But beauty without respect eventually rots from underneath. Then I looked directly at Ethan and spoke softly enough that everyone leaned forward to hear me. Your father spent his whole life protecting this family, I said. The difference is that he never imagined I would eventually need protection from it. 3 months later, the maple trees lining Birchwood Lane had turned gold and orange beneath the cold October sky. I drove past Ethan's neighborhood one quiet afternoon on my way back from the farmer's market and barely recognized the house. The flower beds Vanessa once kept perfectly manicured had dried unevenly. One shutter near the upstairs window hung slightly crooked. Even the porch looked emptier somehow, as though tension had finally become visible from the outside. I did not stop the car. I simply slowed for a moment at the corner light and kept driving. Certain chapters do not need revisiting once you finally survive them. The weeks after that dinner changed everything quietly. No screaming. Arguments. No dramatic scenes. Real families rarely fall apart that way. Instead, distance settled slowly between people who no longer knew how to pretend around one another. Ethan called several times after the dinner, but his voice sounded uncertain every time. Like someone waking up inside a life he had stopped examining years ago. The first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Mom, he said softly, I did not realize things had gotten this bad. I stood at my kitchen sink washing strawberries while rain tapped gently against the windows. That was part of the problem, Ethan. Silence followed. Heavy silence. Then eventually he whispered, I am sorry. For a moment, I closed my eyes. Because part of me had waited years to hear those words. But apologies arrive differently once trust has worn away slowly over time. They do not erase things. They simply confirm the damage was real all along. Vanessa never apologized at all. At first she sent long defensive text messages explaining how overwhelmed she had been balancing motherhood, social obligations, and Ethan's career pressures. Then came anger. Sharp accusations about humiliation and betrayal. Finally, silence. Complete silence. Robert later told me she moved into a luxury apartment downtown after several ugly arguments with Ethan about finances and the trust documents. Apparently reality feels very different once comfort is no longer guaranteed. Ethan remained in the house alone with Mia most weekdays. He looked exhausted the last time I saw him in person. Older somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like somebody finally carrying responsibilities he used to hand quietly to others. He visited my house one Sunday afternoon carrying grocery bags and an awkward expression. We sat together on the back porch drinking coffee while autumn wind scattered leaves across the yard. For a while, neither of us spoke much. Then finally Ethan looked down at his hands and asked the question I think had been haunting him ever since that dinner. When did I become this person? The sadness in his voice caught me off guard because it sounded genuine. Not defensive. Not manipulative. Just lost. I looked at my son. Carefully then. The same boy who once cried when he accidentally stepped on a bird's wing at age 8. The same teenager who worked late shifts after school to help George pay for my surgery years ago. People rarely transform into strangers overnight. More often, they slowly trade pieces of themselves away without noticing. Comfort. Ego. Convenience. Marriage. Image. One compromise at a time. You stopped paying attention, I answered quietly. Ethan nodded slowly as though he already knew that was true. We sat there listening to wind move through George's old maple tree while the distance between us shifted into something quieter and more honest than before. Healing does not begin with forgiveness. It begins with recognition. Mia started visiting again a few weeks later. At first she seemed nervous around me, hovering awkwardly near doorways like a child entering somebody else's home. But children notice truth faster than adults think. One afternoon while we baked blueberry muffins together, she suddenly looked up from the mixing bowl and whispered, "Mom says you made everybody hate her." I kept stirring carefully for a moment before answering. "No, sweetheart. Choices do that on their own sometimes." Mia grew quiet after that. Then softly, almost too softly to hear, she asked, "Were we mean to you?" The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and warm butter. Outside, rain tapped lightly against the porch roof. I looked at my granddaughter and saw confusion there. Not cruelty. Children reflect what they are taught until somebody finally teaches them something gentler. Sometimes, I answered honestly. But I think all of us forgot something important for a while. "What?" she asked. I slid the tray into the oven and closed the door gently before answering. That family is supposed to make people feel loved. Not useful. Mia stared at me silently after that. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her small arms carefully around my waist. The gesture surprised both of us. I rested my hand lightly against her hair and closed my eyes for one brief moment. Not because everything was fixed. It was not. Some fractures remain visible forever no matter how carefully people try repairing them. But pain no longer controlled the room the way it used to. Later that evening after Mia left with Ethan, I carried a blanket onto the back porch and sat alone beneath the fading sunset. The air smelled like wood smoke from a nearby chimney. Somewhere down the street, somebody laughed while unloading groceries from their car. Ordinary life continuing quietly all around me. George's old wind chime moved softly above the porch steps, filling the silence with familiar music. I thought about the woman who stood silently cleaning bathrooms just months earlier because she believed love required endless sacrifice. I barely recognized her now. Not because I had become harder. Because I had finally remembered my own worth. I looked out across the darkening yard and smiled faintly to myself. Then I whispered the words George once wrote for me years before all of this began. Love does not require you to shrink yourself for other people's comfort. And for the first time since losing him, the house no longer felt empty when the night grew quiet.